Welcome to our show, Advanced Broadcast Technology. I'm your guest host, Chris Graham, in for Palab Chatterjee. Joining us today is Jeff Urich, the Product Marketing Manager at Nanosys. Jeff has graciously offered to walk us through some of the current work that is being done on color standards for video and what to look for in seeing them on displays. Jeff works at the cutting edge of the display business. Now, thankfully, Jeff has become a key resource on the science, software, and engineering that go into making the displays we use today and the advanced displays that are being developed for tomorrow. In addition to his other activities, Jeff writes the Nanosys.color blog on emerging display technologies. Nanosys is one of the leading companies in the development of quantum dot technology for displays, with a long history of partnering with leading display makers in creating standout tablets, TVs, and smartphones, thinner, lighter, brighter, and more colorful than ever before. Welcome, Jeff. This should be a very interesting show.
Thanks for the intro, Chris. It's really great to be here, and I look forward to talking to you guys about color standards for video. So let's dive in. First, a little background on my company, Nanosys. We're really the quantum dot company, located here in Silicon Valley, really the first company to focus on quantum dots since our founding in 2001. And today, the world's leading supplier of quantum dots and quantum dot technology for the display industry. The company has a really great patent portfolio and about 100 employees, again, all located here in Silicon Valley. So you might be asking, why is a nanomaterials guy interested in color performance for displays? So we'll talk about that today. But quick overview on what we're going to talk about today. First, why does wide color gamut matter? Wide color gamut segment of the market is something that's very interesting to me, and so I'll try to set the context for that for you. We'll talk a little bit about color and the human visual system, go over some common color metrology, how do we measure color performance for displays, look at some common color gamut standards that are in use in the industry, and I have a note in here too about thinking about color for high dynamic range displays. This is a really exciting area for display technology right now, and there's some important implications for color, so we'll talk about that. And then, of course, talk about quantum dot technology and how it's enabling the market for wide color gamut displays today. So before we really jump in, I think it's really helpful to set the context for why wide color gamut displays are interesting. You see here an image of Washington, D.C. Well, it turns out that the display market is cranking out 180 million square meters of display area every year. This is equivalent to actually a little bit larger than Washington, D.C. covered in displays. So it's pretty amazing to try to wrap your mind around that. And one of the fastest growing segments within this market is for displays with enhanced color performance, otherwise known as wide color gamut displays. Over 1/3 of this display area across all device types, from smartphones to tablets to monitors and TVs, will be covered with technology that can recreate wide color gamuts by the year 2020. It's growing fast too, about a 50% annual compound growth rate. So it's a really fast growing, really interesting market segment. One of the things that we think is driving this is a strong preference for consumers for color versus resolution, for example. Everybody's really familiar with high resolution devices. Many of us have, retina resolution smartphones. But it turns out that consumers would actually prefer actually about 86% of consumers, according to a 3M study, would prefer a display with wide color gamut and only HD resolution versus a display with 8K resolution and only a limited color gamut. One of the reasons for this is that display standards for color haven't evolved very much since the early 1990s. Think of other technology from the early 1990s, showing here early 90s cell phone. Things have really changed a lot since then. Well, color standards haven't, and the HDTV standard for color, for example, that we've been using today, only can show about 1/3 of the range of color that our eyes can detect. In terms of resolution, on the other hand, HDTVs since the late 90s have been delivering the equivalent of retina resolution to our living room since, again, the late 90s. So there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of color performance for displays. So to understand what's driving this preference a little bit more, let's start by looking at how we see color. Now, the first thing to know about color is that color is not inherent in objects. The color of objects that our eyes see in nature is determined by 3 things: physical, physiological, and psychological. Physical is a constant based on the laws of nature. the quality of the illumination in the light source, and the reflectance of the object. In the image above, the ball appears red to the eye because it's reflecting long wavelength red light from the sun while absorbing other shorter wavelength colors. Physiological is also a relative constant, and it's based on the electrochemical processes of the eye. The retina contains photoreceptor nerve cells, which take the light and transform them into electrical impulses. These impulses are sent through the optic nerve of the eye and onto the brain, which processes and creates the image we see, and that's the psychological component. Things change a bit when we introduce a camera and display system between the object and our eye. So the color appearance of objects, again, that we see in nature is based on reflected light from a light source, typically the sun, which contains a broad mix of every color our eyes can detect. Most displays are limited to mixing just 3 primary colors, red, green, and blue. This is called additive mixing. When all 3 colors are on, you get white. When red and green add together, you see yellow, and so on. Because of this, the range of color a display can produce is limited by the quality of red, green, and blue that it can produce. So how do we measure this? The most common approach to measuring color for displays is via a color space. While there are a number of different types of color spaces, we're specifically interested in chromaticity diagrams, which only measure color quality, independent of other factors like luminance. A color space is a uniform representation of visible light. It maps all the colors visible to the human eye onto an XY grid and assigns them measurable values. This lets us make uniform measurements and comparisons between colors and offers us some certainty that images will look the same from display to display when used to create color standards. Here, we're looking at the most popular color space in use today, called CIE 1976, or U'-V', after the arbitrary units that are used to measure the space's XY axes. This color space gets its name from the Commission Internationale de l'Éclairage, or CIE. The CIE are an international standards body founded over 100 years ago to drive forward the science of art and color vision. This 1976 space was completed in the year 1976, but it's really based on work that began at the CIE in the 1930s and actually much earlier than that to develop this color space based on human perception of color appearance. There are some key features of the CIE 76 diagram to keep in mind. The edge of the diagram, shown here, is called the spectral locus. This represents pure monochromatic light, measured by wavelength in nanometers. It starts from about 380 nanometers on the bottom here and goes up to 500 here and then all the way out to over 680 or 700 or so. The bottom edge of the display, of the CIE diagram rather, is called the line of purples. These are fully saturated colors, but they can only be made by mixing 2 colors, in this case red and blue. The least saturated colors are at the center of the diagram, emanating from white. Color gamuts are a subset of colors that can be represented by mixing the colors at their corners. A color gamut shows us the range of color that a display can reproduce. The colors along any line between 2 points in a gamut can be made by mixing the colors at the endpoint. So green plus red again equals yellow, blue plus green is cyan, red plus green plus blue equals white if you add all 3 together. This is an example of a very common color gamut. Here we're showing the Rec 709 color gamut, which is also the HDTV standard that we already mentioned. So here are 5 quick rules to know about when measuring and comparing color gamuts. The first thing to keep in mind, in marketing displays, manufacturers often use color gamut area, coverage area, as a shorthand for color performance. You'll often see claims of 100% or even 125% color gamut. Well, these claims are totally meaningless without a reference. 100% of what? Without a reference gamut, this really doesn't mean anything. As an example, I've overlaid a fictional displayed color gamut here over the Rec 709 gamut standard. The gamut that I've overlaid is exactly the same area as Rec 709, so technically correct to say that it's 100% gamut. But quite obviously, this display does not reproduce the Rec 709 gamut accurately. This leads us to number 2. Area does not equal coverage. So here are 5 quick rules for comparing display color gamut performance. The first thing to know, in marketing displays, manufacturers often use color gamut area as a shorthand for color performance. You'll often see claims of 100% or even 125% color gamut. These claims are totally meaningless without a reference. 100% of what? Well, without a reference gamut, it really doesn't mean anything. As an example, I've overlaid a fictional display color gamut here over the Rec 709 standard. It's exactly the same area as Rec 709, so technically it's correct to say it's a 100% gamut, but quite obviously this display does not reproduce the Rec 709 gamut accurately. This leads us to number 2. Area does not equal coverage. So even if you're told the display is 100% Rec 709, you can't be sure you're getting an accurate display unless you know the overlap between the display gamut and the standard. In the example at the right, the display is 100% Rec 709 area size, but only 80% coverage. Again, this is a really big difference in accuracy. Number 3, gamut is independent of luminance. It's really important to remember that the CIE diagram is 2-dimensional. It only tells us about color gamut at one fixed luminance level. This is important to keep in mind when we're evaluating high dynamic range or HDR displays, since some display technologies can produce accurate colors only at low luminance. So you may be seeing quoted performance for both high luminance and accurate color, but you could find that the display is unable to accurately render color at all luminance levels. And we'll touch on this a little bit more later in the presentation. Number 4, another common mistake people make when thinking about color for displays is they mix up bit depth with color gamut. Color gamut is all about the range of colors the display can reproduce, while bit depth describes the discrete number of colors the display can show. It's definitely desirable to have both wide color gamut and high bit depth, but not all displays are made this way. And you can see what happens in this chart here. If you have low bit depth, even if you have a wide range of colors, you can end up with banding because you don't have a high number of discrete colors. So you want a high bit depth to have a nice, smooth gradient between colors. Number 5, never use the NTSC 1953 gamut. The NTSC color gamut, it's a large gamut, and some manufacturers are still using it, but this standard was developed in the 1950s, 1953 exactly, and was designed for TV broadcast for color, and was actually never deployed in broadcast or in displays. So when you see this thrown about, it just really doesn't mean anything. So please ignore NTSC 1953. So let's look at some common color gamut standards that you might see, what markets they're designed for, and how they stack up. Now, here is an overview of several common color gamuts. There's actually a lot more color gamuts out there that you could go and dig up, but these are some of the most common ones. And again, here we've crossed off NTSC just to remind you, never use the NTSC 1953 color gamut. So let's start back with this raw CIE diagram. The colored area here actually represents all the colors that our eye can perceive. And we can think of this as a really theoretical limit for display system colorimetry. Colors that are found outside this boundary are imaginary, so they're not worth thinking about reproducing. It's really exciting to think about or imagine a display that could reproduce this full range of colors that our eyes can detect, but we're not quite there technologically. So what's a more reasonable goal for a display color gamut? Well, thinking back to the way we see color, the first component that we talked about was the physical aspect of color reproduction. If we could come up with a color gamut of physical objects found in the real world, that would be a more practical requirement for a display color gamut. Fortunately, a guy named Pointer has done this for us. For his 1980 publication, Pointer measured over 4,000 samples and was able to define a color gamut of real surface colors of actual objects found in nature. The result is commonly called Pointer's gamut, and this is a really great place to start. If we could reproduce all the colors found in the natural world, think about what that would mean for e-commerce, and of course it would be a really lifelike display experience. But how important are those extra colors? We're looking here at Pointer's gamut mapped against the HD TV or Rec 709 color gamut here. HD gamut, as we know, only covers about a third of the colors our eyes can detect, but it does cover 70% of Pointer's gamut, so it's already pretty good. Do we really need these deep, fringe kind of cyans and reds every day, or are they kind of just infrequent or rare colors? Well, it turns out that we do. A recent Pantone color of the year was this deep emerald green color, and then actually falls outside the HD broadcast standard. An important and popular color that appears a bit too yellowish on your computer monitor when you're shopping for that perfect tie on Amazon. So there's some really important colors that fall outside Rec 709 broadcasts. And Rec 709 is not so great. So let's look at another gamut. This is Adobe RGB. And Adobe RGB is a fairly common color gamut. It's popular among photographers, and it's in use actually in many cameras today. It's much better. It covers about 38% of the visible spectrum and a more respectable 80% of Pointer's gamut. But you'll notice that the only improvement here is in green. So it does cover our Pantone color, but it's not getting us any more blue or any more red. And it's also worth noting, because we're focused on video systems here, that Adobe RGB standard is really not used for video. So it's not useful spec for people interested in video. So there's definitely some interesting colors that fall outside of both Adobe and Rec 709. Films, which sometimes rely on the wider color gamut capabilities of color film and digital cinema projection, can create these uniquely cinematic experiences. One that I really like is The Ring, which uses this deep cyan cast throughout the film to create this really kind of sickly, spooky, scary story vibe in the film. Contains colors that fall in the cyan range well outside of Rec 709. Or some of the popular blockbuster movies like the Transformers use these really deeply saturated oranges, reds, and teal greens to tell this, with this kind of eye-popping palette, to tell this kind of exciting sci-fi movie story about these giant robots. So these colors fall outside of, especially on the red side, outside of both Adobe and Rec 709. Well, this leads us to the DCI P3 color space. DCI is short for Digital Cinema Initiative, and the DCI P3 gamut is this voluntary specification for digital cinema projectors initially. It was developed by Disney, Fox, Paramount, Sony, Universal, and I think Warner Brothers. The gamut was designed to match the color reproduction capabilities of film stock. It's used today for digital cinema projection, and increasingly for home theater with broad support from both projectors and a growing number of consumer devices. Actually, recently, the Ultra HD Alliance made the DCI P3 standard a minimum requirement for TVs to receive the group certification as a premium device. The P3 space covers about 42% of the color space the human eye can see, and covers 85.5% of pointers gamut. So it's also a big improvement. But it's still short of that true lifelike experience. And this brings us to BT 2020. BT 2020 is a massive color gamut that covers 76% of the space seen by the human eye and nearly 100% of pointers gamut, like 99.9%. This is actually the Ultra HD TV color signaling standard. So when you combine this with the high resolution Ultra HD 4K or 8K, high dynamic range, and multi-channel surround, Ultra HD TV really makes you feel like you're there. Hollywood has already begun to embrace this color gamut for its storytelling potential. One of my favorite examples of this is the movie Inside Out by Pixar. This animated movie really pushed the boundaries of BT 2020 gamut to help tell this really cool story about the emotions inside this girl's head. You know, how red is the character, the anger character, right? So they pushed it way into the corner of BT 2020 and really took advantage of the creative power of that color gamut. So millions of consumer devices are already capable of reading the BT 2020 signal from Ultra HD TVs to Ultra HD Blu-ray players, but very few devices are capable of reproducing that full range of color. Until recently, only really laser projection systems could actually reproduce a significant portion of this huge color gamut. But emerging display technologies like quantum dots are helping to bring BT 2020 to consumer displays. We'll soon see displays on the market that can do over 90% coverage of BT 2020 based on these technologies. So is that it? Is BT 2020 as far as we'll ever need to go in color gamut? Well, not quite. If you remember earlier, I said Pointer measured all the surface colors found in nature. Well, surface colors are objects that are reflecting light. He didn't really capture emissive colors from things like lava, or my favorite example, which is fireworks. And there's a few common fireworks colors that we're mapping onto the CIE gamut here. And as you can see, some of these fall outside both Pointer's gamut and BT 2020. So there's still room for improvement if we're thinking about emissive colors. And we haven't answered that technologically in terms of display gamuts, but I'd like to add in here the ACES gamut. This is short for Academy Color Encoding System. This is a gamut that was developed by the Motion Picture Academy. These are the folks who put on the Oscars. It contains over 100% of the colors that our eye can see. And you can actually see the bottom, the blue primary shooting well off of the page here. Covers, of course, all of Pointer's gamut. And a lot of imaginary colors as well. It just captures kind of the whole CIE diagram. And this is because ACES is not really intended to be a display gamut. Its purpose is as a container gamut and designed really for archival and workflow purposes. But what's cool about ACES is that as the display technology improves and we're capturing and storing content in this space, we'll have this great archive of content to go back to. Maybe someday we'll be able to actually accurately reproduce those fireworks after all. BT 2020 is a great segue into thinking about high dynamic range, or HDR, and color. HDR is one of the most exciting areas in display technology right now. You might be familiar with the term HDR from a feature that you have in your smartphone camera. But HDR for video is a little bit different. So we've been talking about improving the range of colors that our displays can show to more closely match the capability of our eyes. Well, HDR takes that further by adding a luminance dimension to this. The human visual system is capable of adapting to an incredible range of luminance, from starlit, moonlit night, the luminance of 0.0001 nits, to a brightly lit summer's day, that's 600 or even 10,000 nits. Nits is a measure of luminance. Well, this is over 8 orders of magnitude. And perhaps even more incredible, our eye can access over 5 orders of magnitude of that range at any given time. So until recently, camera and display systems have not been able to really come close to matching this level of performance. On the display side, movie theaters we're showing here can only display up to maybe 50 or 80 nits peak luminance at most. Conventional TV, the standard is set to 100 nits, but TVs are on the market at 300 and 400 nits, but still well short of that 10,000 nit peak that our eye can see. Well, the high dynamic range content we have is mastered to show an incredible range of luminance. The standard can show us all the way up to 10,000 nits. Of course, we don't have displays yet that can reproduce this whole range of luminance, but they're improving every day, and there's actually displays that are nearly 2,000 nits peak luminance on the market today. So it's an incredibly lifelike experience when you combine the wider luminance range of HDR with the wide color gamut experience. This is really, really immersive. Of course, we can't really demo this for you here, but this is a great, because your display is limited, and I believe our capture system is limited here. But this is a great simulated example from Dolby on the difference between standard dynamic range on the left and high dynamic range with both broader luminance range and wide color gamut, courtesy of Dolby. And so it's a really, really immersive, lifelike experience. There's some interesting things to think about when we think about color for HDR systems. Because HDR combines both high luminance with wide color gamut, but not all display technologies can really do this. This is a really great example here. We're looking at this bright orange lava color from the volcano. And if you look, it appears to be, and we've kind of highlighted it here with the orange color. And if we look inside of our CIE diagram, it appears to be in gamut. It appears to be well within the Rec 709 color gamut in our 2D chromaticity diagram. If you looked at this, you'd say, great, no problem, this display can accurately show this color. But that actually might not be the case. If we take that gamut and kind of flip it on its back, and you see the CIE diagram kind of in 2D here on the bottom of this chart, and we're extending out a luminance in the z-axis, also labeled here as y. And we're showing from 1 to 10,000 nits in luminance. And when you pull this out in the luminance dimension, you can see that this orange color is actually too bright to be reproduced by the BT709 display. So it's really important to think not just about the actual chromaticity diagram for HDR displays, but also to think about what the capability of the display is in terms of luminance. And not all display technologies can do this the same way. So taking another look at this volcano here, and you see on the left the display, both displays, left and right, have the same kind of basic specs. Both are doing 100% DCI-P3. Both have luminance of up to 1,000 nits. But the display on the left uses a pure RGB color reproduction system. And you can see it looks fully saturated. The display on the right is deploying what's called a RGBW system. And this display adds a white subpixel to the red, green, and blue subpixels. As the luminance increases, the display technology is not actually able to keep increasing with the red, green, and blue alone. And so it starts to lean more and more on this white subpixel in order to boost up the luminance. So at brighter luminances, this display has actually a narrower color gamut. So something to really be careful of when you're thinking about high dynamic range and color is what is the technology for the display, and is it capable of producing accurate color at all luminance range. So we've talked a little bit about color, how you measure color, important color gamut standards, talked a little bit about HDR, and mentioned along the way some of the technologies that are enabling wide color gamut displays. Well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about quantum dots, and that's Nanosys technology, and how quantum dots are enabling us to do BT 2020 color today. So the first thing to know about quantum dots is that they're super, super small. Quantum dots are these tiny semiconductor nanocrystal particles that are a little bit bigger than a water molecule and kind of in the size regime of a strand of DNA, about 2 to 8 nanometers in diameter. So super, super small. Quantum dots have this kind of, they might be small, but they have this kind of superpower, which is that the size of the nanocrystal determines the wavelength of light that it gives off. So quantum dot crystals absorb short wavelength blue light, kind of charges up the crystal, and they spit off a different photon of a longer wavelength. The larger the crystal, the longer the wavelength. Shorter the crystal, the shorter the wavelength. This allows us to tune a spectrum to perfectly match a display standard. So we're looking at the visible spectrum here in nanometers, starting from purples on the left all the way to infrared on the right. And typical displays use red, green, and blue, again, to make all the colors we see. If we look at a typical display lighting system, this is an LED backlight, you see that the display has a broad peak, or a narrow peak in blue, and this broad kind of peak across yellow and green and into red. Well, when the display is trying to make red light, it has a very limited area of color here. It actually has this kind of peak that's going from orange all the way out into infrared. It's not very defined. What quantum dots allow us to do is to use that size-controlled capability of the nanocrystal to deliver perfect red, green, and blue color. So we get very, very pure, very accurate color. Because we can move those peaks around to any wavelength, we're able to recreate perfect, accurate color for BT 2020. You see here a color gamut area on the right. Nanosys quantum dots are able to almost perfectly nail the red and the green and the blue points for BT 2020. We do this by mixing blue LED with a 450 nanometer emission peak with a 1.5 nanometer sized quantum dot crystal, which emits 525 nanometer green, a 3 nanometer sized red crystal, which emits 633 nanometer red, and you again nail those perfect 3 points of the BT 2020 color gamut. And I believe the coverage is something like 93%. So well above 90% and continuing to improve. And this is something that quantum dots are enabling today. So just wrapping up, we talked a little bit about the wide color gamut market, why it's an interesting and exciting market, looked at some important color gamut standards, highlighting BT 2020, some rules for thinking about and measuring different gamuts, looked a little bit about color for HDR, and some of the enabling technologies like quantum dots that are allowing wide color gamut to come to market and to continue growing. So thanks so much.